His post is, quote, "The president taking over local control of MPD and putting the U.S. military onto the streets of D.C. under the guise of public safety is wrong."
Okay, you can't make this stuff up. So by now, I'm sure you've heard about Donald Trump wanting to mobilize the National Guard to Washington, D.C. in order to control the crime rate. Well, over on CNN, they're almost seeing this as a conspiracy.
Which to me also then begs the question, well, what is he a little nervous about over here if he needs to dip into this well right now on this topic?
Yeah.
Now, despite Washington, D.C. having one of the worst crime rates in the United States, CNN and other lawmakers just cannot fathom why would Donald Trump want to mobilize every asset he can to try and control the crime rate. Now, before we start the video, make sure to please like the video. It's the #1 way you guys are helping this channel, but it also helps others see the videos as well, and I think people want to see these reactions.
Getting reaction from D.C. council members.
We are, Pamela and Wolf. This coming into CNN from Council Member Charles Allen of the 6th Ward in D.C. His post is, quote, "The president taking over local control of MPD and putting the U.S. military onto the streets of D.C. under the guise of public safety is wrong. It's an extreme, outrageous, and dangerous move for our city and the safety of all of our residents." He's the first city council member to react to this whole thing.
Again, I don't know if it's the best look as a Democrat right now to get mad at Donald Trump for wanting to make the city safe. If you are unaware, check this out. You see, if you don't have the full context, of course you're going to think it's pretty wild that a president is trying to mobilize the military and take over the police. But just last month, a DC police commander was suspended for trying to skew the crime stats in order to make it look like the police have everything under control. So keep this in mind. That was just last month.
Muriel Bowser's office and the office of the Metropolitan Washington Police Department for their response. We started to reach out to them while this news conference was going on. No word back from them yet. The mayor has been fairly muted in her comments on this. She did speak out yesterday in an interview, but did not openly criticize the president for this.
Again, that really breaks this narrative that mayors don't like when they get help from a president. What mayor would get upset if the president is trying to make your city safe? Oh yeah, the Los Angeles mayor, she got pretty upset about it.
It's an extraordinary move. We have to point out, never before in American history has a U.S. president taken over control of the Metropolitan Washington, D.C. Police Department. How is this going to work on the streets? How is it going to work from a command and control standpoint? That is a huge, huge question. And of course, his threat to do this in other cities, we'll see how that plays out. I think you got to see how it really plays out here first.
Right.
Notice he's calling it a threat. Again, I wanted to give you guys that full context of we just had a police commander trying to change the stats. Once it gets to that level, obviously, you're going to have a president who's like, okay, if we have the police who don't even agree with the stats and they want to make it look better, I think we have to outdo them by actually fixing the stats. You can leave your comments down below how you feel about all of this. Real quick, before we continue, make sure to please subscribe to my channel so I can keep you guys up to date with what's going to happen in Washington, D.C. Without a doubt, we will probably see a lot of opposition against these federal agents or the National Guard, and I want to make sure you guys are informed when it happens.
Why is this issue, and again, you're going to get into the fact check of what is wrong about his figures or not, but why is this the top of the President of the United States agenda today? And I think that's an important question for us to think about as we think about everything that's on his plate. Why is taking over law enforcement in the District of Columbia? Now, he made the argument as to why, and that it's a capital city, and that the way he sees it is that it is crime-ridden and needs to be changed. But still, why is the President of the United States putting that front and center? So that's a question
Again, I never thought we would see the day where news anchors or a lot of these Democrats are upset that Donald Trump made this a priority. I can understand where they're coming from, and I think you know where this is going. We're getting into the conspiracy territory, but I never thought we would see people get upset that Donald Trump is trying to fix up a city.
Sort of try to think about as we put this into perspective. But then, Dana, as you were noting, yes, this is a dramatic moment, but it also feels to me like dipping into a well that President Trump has gone to time and time again in the first term and this term. The tactics here may be more amped up and dramatic, but the going after this city or other cities as sort of crime-ridden, this was the heart of many of the campaigns and political agenda that Trump puts before voters. And so to me, I see him dipping back into a well of something he feels is a strong suit and where he thinks he has stronger footing the way he does.
Yes, that is true. The majority of Americans don't like crime. That is like a statistical fact. But at the same time, a lot of people don't really seem to care about Washington, D.C. So Donald Trump is making this about crime. A lot of these commentators, they're making it about Washington, D.C.
With immigration or border security, which to me also then begs the question, well, what is he a little nervous about over here if he needs to dip into this well right now on this topic?
Yeah.
Again, the implications here. What is he worried about over here? Am I crazy for thinking we're getting into conspiracy territory? Donald Trump and his voters don't like crime. What you're seeing here is wanting to destroy and get rid of the crime in the city he happens to live and operate out of.
Police are standing, and they're told, don't do anything under any search. So this, and you can see they want to get at it. And they're standing there, and people are spitting in their face, and they're not allowed to do anything. But now they are allowed to do whatever the hell they want.
Whatever the hell they want, as if police have been not doing anything before this, Eddie. What do you make of that?
Again, I have to remind you guys, a month ago, why were the stats trying to be skewed if we're not in this position today?
Whatever the hell they want.
Chris, to be honest with you, I'm trying to hold my temper. I think there's an ongoing argument that he's having in his head with Black Lives Matter. There's an ongoing argument that he's having with the questions around criminal justice reform and police reform. It's interesting that he really doesn't really care about what's actually happening in D.C. on a certain level, because he's not trying to get at the underlying root causes. He's not looking at examples of how to address rising crime rates that doesn't require a form of policing that leads to increased incarcerality and the like. Let's look at what's going on in Baltimore. Let's look at.
You guys can leave your comments down below how you feel about this. If you have a neighborhood that's destroyed by crime, by bringing in more police, is that a bad thing? Now, bringing in the police and the National Guard and having total authority over the police officers to do what they need to do to clear up the area, is that a bad thing? There seems to be a divide here on how people are perceiving all of this. Again, go look into the Washington, D.C. crime stats. It is quite an issue and an outlier that Donald Trump is trying to fix.
What's happening actually in places like Baltimore and Chicago, right? So part of what we have to do is to understand. And Oakland, we have to understand this, Chris, within the context of Donald Trump's racial politics and within the context of his effort to get Epstein off the front pages. I understand David's point. But when we try to treat this as a rational response, then we lose sight of the actual politics that's being played here.
By the way, I don't think this is rational. What's irrational, it's what's been happening in Washington, D.C., so Donald Trump has to waste his time and resources to now bring all of these assets to try and fix Washington, D.C. I don't think anyone sees this as rational, but when you look into the context of things, this seems to be what's needed for cities who can't control their crime.
And he's actually trying to give his base red meat to get them off of the Epstein story, and it's on the backs of citizens in Washington, D.C. He's going to undermine the democratic process in the district. And so I understand what David is trying to say, but we need to be clear about what Donald Trump is doing.
So MSNBC, they seem to be taking the same route as CNN. He's only doing this to get everyone looking the other direction from stories that are popping up. However, even CNN seems to have maybe accidentally or maybe purposely debunked this entire narrative.
I would say that this is, from at least a political point of view, quickly turning into a dud of a story. What am I talking about here?
Which is wild.
Which is wild. Which is
this has been for 3 weeks.
Exactly.
Now.
Take a look.
And by the way, this was aired before the announcement of Donald Trump wanting to mobilize the National Guard and take control of the police.
Here, Google searches for Epstein down 89% versus just 3 weeks ago. falling through the floor. It is no longer the top term searched alongside Donald Trump's name. That's been trading off between Taros and Vladimir Putin, with obviously the meeting coming up later this week. But at this particular point, the American people's interest in this story, it's quickly becoming something of a nothing burger.
So out of sight, out of mind, maybe, is applying here a little bit. But has it impacted, have you seen numbers that have impacted Trump's popularity, favorability, anything?
No, not really. I mean, take a look here. Let's take a look at the overall numbers. Trump's approval rating in July of 2025, it was 45%. It's still well within that margin of error here at 44%.
I don't think we can deny, especially as Republicans and conservatives, this is still an issue on a lot of people's radars. A lot of people are asking, hey, Pam Bondi, you talked about the list, the documents. There seems to be some conflicting information. I will not deny there are a ton of Republicans that are still asking questions. But the point of this is to show you, on the grand scheme of things, in connection to the National Guard and the police, nobody cares. Overall speaking, nobody really seems to care.
And you compare that to where he was in his first term at this point. He was at 37%, so he's 7 points higher, very much in a different political universe now, significantly higher in terms of his overall approval rating than he was at this point in his first term. And more than that, among Republicans, his approval rating is near a record high, hovering right at about that 90% mark. So no, he hasn't lost any of that base. And when it comes to that center of the electorate, he's basically holding on there. And his overall approval rating, 44%, is pretty gosh darn good for him, considering where he was at this point in term number one.
What do you think is behind it? Why there hasn't been more movement?
Yeah, why hasn't there been more movement? I think this is pretty simple. Take a look here. Nation's top issue is the Epstein case. This is the number of respondents. This isn't the percentage of respondents. This is the number of respondents. In our last CNN poll, look at this. 0 respondents said that the Epstein case was the top issue. How about among independents? 0 independents said that. And among Republicans, and therefore overall, just a single one.
Again, leave your comments down below if this is a top issue for yourself. When you use the word top issue, for a lot of people who can't afford to buy a home, who can't find a job, that's probably going to be one of the top issues for the majority of Americans, the increase of prices around them, stuff like that. But again, the point here is that the Epstein story was a massive story just a few weeks ago. But in the grand scheme of things, when you really think about it, Trump voters voted for Donald Trump to help take care of crime, to help take care of security for the country. So when you have these news anchors who are trying to connect Donald Trump to Epstein and how he's just pushing the police thing on Washington, D.C. in order to distract everyone, the stats don't lie, and this is straight from CNN.
So yes, there used to be a lot of interest in this story, but the bottom line is that even amongst those who had high interest in this story, it wasn't something that they thought was all that important. And as I said at the beginning, the interest in this story has fallen off the table.
Which also, when you look at this and you compare it to just the attention that Capitol Hill was giving it, Donald Trump supporters were giving it, congressional committees were giving it, it is incongruous.
I would just say this. Donald Trump has some of the best political instincts of any politician I've seen. And on this particular issue, you see it full well and clear, because he has been saying, you know what, this is not an issue, and it turns out that a lot of the American public actually seem to agree with him.
Again, from CNN themselves.
Mr. President, the following is what happens when you let good cops be cops, and I just want to highlight that before I get into Northern Virginia. This year alone, under President Trump's administration, we've had over 4,000 child victims identified and found. That's a 33% increase from the same time period last year. 33% increase. We've had a seizure of 1,500 kilograms of fentanyl up to this date. That is a 25% increase since the same time period last year. And just to put it in perspective, 1,500 kilograms of fentanyl is enough to kill 115 million Americans. 115 million Americans. Cops are getting after it. The FBI has arrested 19,000 people this year alone. Thanks to President Trump's administrations, that's double than where we were this time last year.
Again, the whole point of this is trying to show the American public, when you allow for a security agency, whether it's the FBI or a local police force, when you allow them to do their job and use every asset possible, you can do good things. But again, this has to be the good cops, not the bad cops or the bad agents. You need the best of the best.
We are now able to report that the murder rate is on track to be the lowest in U.S. history, in modern recorded U.S. history, thanks to this team behind me and President Trump's priorities. And how do we do it? And what are we going to bring to D.C.? What we did in Northern Virginia, thanks to Terry Cole and Governor Youngkin and the team, we stood up a task force out in my Northern Virginia field office, and we said, let's let good cops be cops, let's get them the intelligence and what they need, and let's get the red tape out of their way, and let's get DOJ partnered up with us to bring great prosecutions, and that's exactly what we did. In 1 month, we arrested 545 violent felons. 545 in the state of Virginia, thanks to Governor Youngkin's partnership. And that simplicity in law enforcement is what's coming to Washington, D.C.
Again, a lot of people are really blowing this up to be a complicated thing. Really, let's simplify it. You bring in federal assets. Donald Trump says, I will give you anything you need, but more important, do what you need to do to get the violence and the crime down. And things can happen. When you bring in the National Guard, another federal assets, a lot of this gets blown up out of proportion as if this is all a bad thing.
When you let good cops be cops, when you give them the intel they need, when you work with our Homeland Security Task Force, when you work with Terry and Gaddy and I go way back to Miami, these guys are great leaders of the respective departments and law enforcement capacities. And when you have the DOJ and President Trump driving behind this mission, we are going to clean up Washington, D.C., and we're going to do it the right way, the lawful way, and we're going to make sure Washington, D.C. is safe again. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Attorney General.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Again, leave your comments down below how you feel about all of this. I won't deny, this is a very aggressive response from an administration, but they want to crack down on the violence. You heard it straight from Kash Patel. Overall speaking, the stats are down. Why would you be upset about that? So again, leave your comments down below. Thank you so much for being here. God bless, and we'll see you all later.